All right, welcome. And thank you all today for joining us for Name, Image, Likeness, what it is and what it means for governing boards. Until recently, NCAA rules placed heavy prohibitions on the type of benefits that student athletes could receive while maintaining eligibility. But since last year's Supreme Court decision in NCAA versus Alston holding that many of these restrictions violated federal antitrust law, today, and amidst a patchwork of new state legislation seeking to protect the interests of student athletes, today the possibility exists for student athletes to receive compensation for the use of their name, image, and likeness, known as NIL. Today, we have three national experts who will help us understand the implications, both financial and otherwise, of this new era of higher ed governance. Tom McMillen is president and CEO of the LEAD1 Association. He's been an Olympian, Rhodes Scholar, professional basketball player, U.S. congressman, author, businessman, and for the context of today's panel, a former member of the University of Maryland System Board of Regents. Michael Hsu is the co-founder of the College Basketball Players Association and served as a regent of the University of Minnesota from 2015 to 2021, where he was a tireless advocate for athletes and students in general. Michael's been an active participant in the NIL movement nationally, being one of the first trustees to speak out on this issue. Lyle Adams is the founder and CEO of Spry Payment Systems Incorporated. He's a proud Wake Forest graduate and member of the 2007 NCAA Men's Soccer Championship team, after which he embarked on a professional soccer career. In 2012, he joined Uber as one of its first 100 employees. So his background is in tech, but also has a passion for helping student athletes. Thank you all today. Now, before we get started, just one housekeeping note for the audience. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a button for submitting questions to the panel, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And with that, I'd like to ask each panelist one question, and please chime in any order, hop in. Historically, the NCAA has been the primary authority that colleges and universities have looked to for guidance in terms of oversight of intercollegiate athletic programs. But with NIL, there's this vacuum of authority, sort of this Wild West feel to things. So the question really is, what issues do governing boards need to be thinking about? So maybe Tom, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of things happening with the NCAA because of antitrust lawsuits. They're going through this whole transformation process where a lot of the authority will devolve to the conferences. So some of the conferences may step up because they're more immune from these kinds of antitrust cases. And some of the conferences may step up and they may begin to create some parameters and guardrails here. I don't think that's going to happen until the fall when this sort of initial transformation process begins, and nor do I anticipate this to be heavy regulation because I don't think the conferences who are competing vigorously against each other are going to unilaterally disarm on this NIL issue. And so you're still going to live in a Wild West environment. I always tell people this is like Keystone, Colorado in 1850 with no sheriffs in town. Well, that's exactly what NIL is right now. There's really no enforcement. Even where you have states, the 30 or so states that have state laws, there's nobody, the attorney general, the state police, no one's going to be enforcing miscreants of any of the law. So you were in a situation where you're not going to have anybody enforcing really at the state level. Certainly the national associations, the conferences are going to have a very light touch. And the hope eventually is that Congress will turn to a national, more harmonic regulatory structure, but that will not happen before this election in November, and it may happen in the next Congress, but that's still a long haul in best case. So what do governing boards need to think about? They need to think about all the risk involved here. And we could talk about that in a minute because I know you want to hear from the others, but there's a lot of risk, whether it's bad deals, sports betting, these collectives, which we can talk about and what they mean, gone wild, Title IX. issues. There's just a lot of risk here. And so I'll defer to my my distinguished colleagues, and then we'll continue this discussion on the other side.
Go ahead, Michael.
Go ahead.
No, thank you, Tom. Just echoing what you're saying, I think, boards have to make a decision on how they want to be involved or how they want their institution to be involved. That now ties into what Tom said about risk. Are you risk averse or are you risk tolerant? Because as we've seen over the past 7 months, the space has changed and evolved quite quickly. What we initially anticipated in the summer of 2021 is no longer the case now in April of 2022, as new ideas and business models arise. So being flexible and dynamic when it comes down to risk tolerance and how you want your university to approach this going forward, because you have to have a plan of action and be at the same time flexible and nimble to adapt as things might change in the future.
Yeah, I would agree with everybody so far on this issue. I would say that from a trustee perspective, we're in this position right now because trustees have kind of had a hands-off approach to intercollegiate athletics for a number of years. And part of that is because the Knight Commission in the 90s suggested that maybe the presidents were the best people in position to make these decisions for the entire group, and the entire group being the NCAA. The issue is 2 weeks ago at the Final Four, Mark Emmert's press conference was basically geared to telling Congress that Congress needed to help save the day through some type of preemption. And I think we got to look at how we got to where we are now, which is throwing Hail Marys to Congress, trying to catch the opportunity for antitrust exemptions. And the real question is, if you ask Mark Emmert who's in charge, he'll say the schools are in charge. But if you ask the schools who's in charge, the schools will say, well, Mark Emmert's in charge. And you can't have an organization operate like that if you're going to be making difficult decisions. I think at the individual school level, trustees have to decide. They have to ask questions first, because I think most of them are not educated, because as part of the trustee kind of onboarding process, most trustees are told that the presidents are in charge of intercollegiate athletics and to just let them make the decisions with their athletic directors. I would say that that's a mistake, because you're talking about people who traditionally do not have an intercollegiate athletics experience. Very few presidents today are getting hired to run bigger universities and actually have had that experience in the past. So there's a lot of questions as to how we got to where we are and how we're going to get out of the current situation. But I think you have to examine what the practices are at your institution, which would involve your general counsels, your presidents, your athletic directors, everybody involved so far.
There's a lot of talk here about risks, right? And part of the discussion as to whether or not in the whole NIL debate was, you're opening up a Pandora's box of all these unknowns. And so I guess my question is, what's in Pandora's box? What are the risks that boards need to be cognizant of? What are some some terminology that boards need to know, like collectives?
Well, the first thing, let's talk about sports betting for a minute. As sports betting is becoming more ubiquitous in the United States, now some student athletes are participating in commercials involving casinos, involving promotion of sports books. Some university athletic programs are cutting deals with sports books. So you have a whole new relationships that are being established on college campuses related to sports betting. One of the issues, I think, in NIL is that there are clear-cut winners who are going to make a lot of money, and then everybody else is going to make sort of middling sums. They're not going to make, they're going to make in the hundreds, while others may make in the thousands or even more hundreds of thousands of dollars. that creates a stratification, which could really play into sports, the whole sports betting risk. I mean, if there's a kid on the team that's making nothing from NIL but plays a lot, and the quarterback's making $1 million, there's some susceptibility to potential gambling influences and the like. You don't really have that in the pros because the pros are very tightly monitored, and pretty much everybody is making decent money. But you could have tremendous stratification in colleges, which exacerbates that risk. And then, of course, Title IX as collectives. Collectives are basically groups of boosters that get together, try to raise money, and then provide that money to student athletes for NIL purposes, for the use of their publicity rights. Well, as those collectives grow, you could have, depending on whether the school is involved with the collective or not, you could have levels of Title IX compliance risk. In other words, if all the men through the collective are making lots of money, the women aren't making any or very little, there's potential Title IX litigation risk. There's the potential of bad deals. Kids just do a bad deal, and it comes back on to the university. So there's a whole bunch of these risks out there. I'm most concerned about sports betting because if there is a sports betting scandal, count on that president of that university being on the front page of their local newspaper. Because here's one thing. The United States of America is the only country in the world where there is big time sports betting going on events going on campus. No other university has that. Oxford doesn't have it. The Sorbonne doesn't have it. American universities have it, and it's growing, and it's a big risk.
Yeah, I would just echo that gambling is a big risk, and gambling is just in its infancy right now. I would remind everyone that the Final Four was recently played at the Caesars Superdome. So I mean, it is encroaching on the intercollegiate athletic kind of system very quickly. And as Tom mentioned, there are conferences who are licensing their statistics to gambling companies. And of course, we all know that you can go to Vegas and bet on these games, any game, anytime. And that is quickly coming to your smartphone. And these are state laws. There's a whole bunch of aspects to gambling. But, in terms of NIL, I would say that I'm generally pleased at what's happening with within the NIL world. There are all sorts of things happening. Just yesterday, I heard that Sean Clifford, the quarterback for Penn State, has started his own company with classmates called Limitless NIL. I don't know exactly what they do or how they're doing it, but the fact is these are good developments. They may end up going nowhere, but the fact is they're trying to monetize something in terms of their name, image, and likeness, which is something they've never been able to do before. So I think there are going to be problems. I have not heard of a bad deal yet. I'm sure it's coming. I think everyone knows that the world record right now is the $8 million deal for Amaliba at the University of Tennessee I think that's at Tennessee. But, we'll see what happens to that. There's all sorts of rules that the NCAA could have put in place but didn't. I think there's a lot of risk associated with the way that they did it. They did it only after they couldn't get Congress to actually give them, something that would give them either a preemption to state laws or whatever. But it was an overreach. They didn't get anything, and they just basically had to go with an interim policy, which ironically, I never expected this, but it included the ability for boosters to participate. Okay. Everyone thought that boosters were not allowed to participate or not going to be allowed to participate in their interim rules, but they allowed boosters. So I think the strategy was basically that, hey, we're going to let Pandora's box be open. We're going to allow a lot of bad things to happen. So then we can reapproach Congress and say, hey, look, the system's not working. You guys got to do something. So I think these are all very calculated risks from the NCAA's perspective, but I'll go back to what I said earlier. The individual schools bear some responsibility here. They're allowing these things to happen, and they're now starting to complain. We have coaches complaining with all sorts of things, including NIL, but then including the transfer portal, et cetera, gambling. So I think we're just in this very interesting space where schools have to learn how to protect themselves. And I think hanging back and waiting for this to get resolved is probably the worst thing for schools to do. They do have to, as Lyle said, they have to figure out what their risk profile is, and they have to decide whether or not they're going to let the world develop around them and then try to figure out how to compete later.
So Lyle, actually, I want to direct this next question to you, and maybe this connects with kind of what I think you may be leading into, which is look at risk in a different way, right? This is something that NIL is something that it's not just for the high, the revenue sports. It's not just for for Division I. It's for every institution. So when I'm thinking risk, I'm looking at student athletes, the risk of student athletes, and kind of what things do they need to look out for? How do we protect them from bad deals or other implications of this?
Great question. So I would say it's twofold. Follow up on Tom and Michael's thing about big picture stuff. Not only sports gambling, but NIL is opportunity, right? At a macro level, NIL is opportunity for student athletes now to learn a skill, learn a business, learn how to market themselves at the end of the day. So theoretically and conceptually, it's a wonderful concept. But, looking at myself, what I know now as an adult was vastly different than I did when I was 18, which now leads me to my next point, education and awareness, right? You have to teach student athletes what to look for. As you go to college, and if you're a college athlete, they teach you the playbook if you're playing football. And there's cues that you have to read as a football player or a soccer player as a defender, right? A basketball player looks for cues. But these are business deals that we don't have any experience within. So how do you now judge a good deal from a bad deal? Because anyone offering a student athlete $5,000 in their pocket seems like a very good deal up front. But when you start peeling back the envelope or reading the fine print, that deal might tell a different story. So that's the thing that concerns me, is that, how do you educate the masses? Because yes, the high profile student athletes could have representation that will help them review and adjudicate these opportunities, but most student athletes will be on their own. And how do you not protect the masses is, what Michael and Tom have alluded to, and I would say trustees need to consider. And that now leads into my final point about APR. I'm very concerned about how APR will decline in the future as a result of NIL. Student athletes with their schedules are already as busy as they are, right? Speaking to a D1 athlete, that's an extra 30 hours a week. I was on the field, practice, traveling for games, all of that now. And my grades weren't going anywhere. Class was also very difficult and challenging. Now you add the complexity of NIL, trying to secure opportunities, trying to review contracts, trying to meet business deadlines. There's only 24 hours in a day, and I'm afraid that some grades and classroom behavior could suffer, or could lead to mental anguish with student athletes. The past 2 years have been really challenging a lot of Americans or people in general in the world due to the COVID pandemic. Right? If you're a student athlete now, you're trying to now navigate going back to class, interacting, maturing, and now doing all of this NIL stuff. Like I said, that can be overwhelming. And so for me, being able to say, hey, what systems do we have in place to support our athletes in terms of education and mental health, I think is also important. Because no one's really thinking about what that's going to look like in GPA and academic progress reports in the calendar year when those grades come out.
A really good point, and it gets at that primary responsibility of any governing boards to ensure the not just the financial but also the intellectual health of the institution, and how do we best support our all of our students and our student athletes. So I guess kind of the next question is, well, what best practices would you suggest for keeping tabs on kind of the whole of the student, that the effect of NIL on the academic side of the house, right? I mean, who's responsible for that even? I mean, is that something that you put on your athletic director, or is that something that is more of a something where you partner with your provost? I'm just kind of curious here. Lyle brings us this point that there are external, there are external effects here.
One thing I will say is that I think Lyle's absolutely right about the fraying of the academic connection with student athletes. It's very real. It's exacerbated even further by the transfer portal, where you can instantaneously transfer. And I think trustees are going to have to really watch the APR, the progress towards degrees of their student athletes, the whole cohort of student athletes, because I think you got to monitor transfers. I mean, just inevitably, when you transfer, you lose credits. I think that would probably be the norm for most transfers. So I think that at the University of Maryland, when I was on the Regents, we created our own sort of athletic subgroup. I think universities are going to have to consider that, because you're going to have to get in the weeds and really watch these issues, because if kids start failing either because of APR pressures that Lyle raised, or there's rampant transfers, you're going to have real academic issues, and I think we're going to see it anyway. We're going to see NIL dropouts. You also have transfer dropouts. Kids are transferring into the portal and are not getting picked up. And so they're kind of lost and may not have another chance to get a college education. So I do think there are some real risks here. The best practices are you better invest in your compliance department very heavily and stay informed as regents, as trustees.
To add to that, I think being informed is the most critical thing, because the world is evolving in NIL at a rapid pace. Like I said, where we were 9 months ago is drastically different from today. And I think the same can be said in December of 2022. So maybe it's focus groups. Maybe you're talking to your student athlete advisory council, your SAC teams, quarterly. Maybe you put a liaison in the athletic department as a trustee, right, to get some real-time feedback hearing from the student athletes. But I think having two-way dialogue is very important, because what the student athlete is hearing is somewhat different than what the administrator sees and feels. And unfortunately, relying on one touch point, you're not going to really paint a holistic picture of what's going on and how you can best provide support, guidance, assistance where you need, you can say. So I think that's kind of the starting point. It's saying, hey, let's now see where we are. In terms of best practices, unfortunately, the United States is a very unique higher education system. There's a lot of different schools, a lot of different structures and titles and organization stuff. So what might work for one institution might not work for another institution. However, though, I think the key here is to be aware of what's out there. Instead of being married to an idea, be dynamic and flexible and say, hey, school A is doing this one, and I've heard really positive results. Maybe school B is doing this one. Let's now try a combination or a hybrid or both. But being able to now listen and adapt, I think, is super critical, because with the pace of things changing, you can't go down one avenue thinking it's the right avenue, and then you realize it's a dead end. Because at that point now you're in between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, I think we got to start at the beginning, which is how much time they're spending in their sport, because that dominates everything. The statistics that have shown that you're spending more than 40 hours a week in your sport. Okay, that's how much your average American full-time worker works, 40 hours a week. And then you really only have 168 hours a week total. You have to sleep. How much time you're going to spend on studying, going to class, NIL stuff, whatever. All that stuff has to, add up to 168 hours in a week. And there are a lot of, I think, people around athletes who are trying to help them navigate and spend their time wisely. Obviously, there is this new thing called NIL. But again, NIL is an option. You don't have to do anything with it. If you happen to have a lot of social media followers, you can actually make money with very little work just by distributing a message that someone's paying you to distribute to your followers. So NIL does not have to take a lot of time, but I do agree that NIL deals have to be people have to be coached in how you deal with an NIL deal. You have to probably have a lawyer look at your contracts. Lawyers, lawyers are doing a lot of work right now trying to get these athletes the best deals possible. And I think they're gonna, hopefully, if you have a lawyer, you're gonna get rid of these bad deals. There are a lot of bad terms out there, but that's just the same as anything else. If you have a lawyer, you have a pretty good chance of mitigating those things. If you don't have a lawyer, you have a pretty good chance of actually finding yourself in deep doo-doo. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for students these days. They just have to know how to get them. There are schools that are actually helping now. Whether or not that's going to be part of a policy to prohibit that, we don't know yet. The Transformation Committee is hard at work at these types of things. But there are also schools that are very creative about creating projects where non-student athletes can participate in helping these students who are athletes, market themselves, figure out how to deal with their social media. There's a whole cottage industry that's going to pop up, and it could involve a lot of their fellow students as well as professors.
So, in terms of being on top of things, and being proactive and looking at and investigating what the implications are of NIL. Let's say that you're a college board and you're not proactive at all. That you don't even know what NIL is. And what are some of the worst case scenarios that could occur that you see, and how will those pop up? What will those manifest as? Just kind of looking from university leadership standpoint.
I'll take a first step, and then I'll share with my panelists. I would approach this as not what the worst does it have, but what's the worst for the university from a perception standpoint, right? Everyone used to play the USA Today test when they teach PR 101, right? If you're going to send an email, if that email shows up on the front page of the USA Today, will you be embarrassed? Yes or no? If the answer is no, don't send the email. It's basically what I was taught growing up. So from an NIL perspective, there are so many different ways that a school can possibly have negative outcomes. Maybe some student athletes now make a ton of money, but they don't pay their taxes and they're audited. But now they blame the school. Or some student athletes lose their scholarships, need-based aid, because they didn't realize NIL money was taxable, right? Or maybe, to Tom's point, maybe a student athlete signs a bad deal. They become a first-round draft pick in a professional sport, and now it's leaked that they signed something in perpetuity while in college because they had no training about what in perpetuity might have meant in a contract. So there's so many different potential minefields that student athletes could navigate. And as Michael mentioned, it's the risk profile. I think a nice exercise is to sit down and say, hey, what's the worst that could happen without us being unaware? And make a list of those items and saying, how can we mitigate at least some of these? Obviously, as new things develop, you might not be able to mitigate or catch everything. But if you say, hey, here are the P0s that I want to ultimately avoid, I think it's a start and you work backwards from there. And I think it's Title IX, making sure that your male and female student athletes have equal opportunity, right? It's the 50th anniversary of Title IX. Now, I don't think anyone wants to be the one saying my male athletes only get stuff and my female athletes get nothing. But then working backwards from there is how I would, approach it if I was in the shoes of some of our trustees in attendance today.
I would echo what Lyle said. It's not unlike being on an audit committee and trying to kind of catalog risk. I actually think the biggest risk is the sports betting risk, because sports betting on universities is so different in America. I mean, it's a uniquely American risk. And I always told people at Oxford, they bet on the crew race, the Oxford Cambridge, but that wasn't even on campus. That was in London. That was one thing a year. Now you're going to have almost, 2-3 games a week where there's going to be massive betting on events on the campus. I even predicted that you'll have a sports book on a campus someday, that you will have a sports book on a campus as part of a kind of a real estate deal. And that will, there's a lot of good parts to sports betting. It increases your fan engagement, could bring some extra money in, but there's real risk there. And if, for example, a player that doesn't have, not getting resources from NIL decides that he can throw a game and make $100,000, particularly with the prop bets, which are the bets that are on a free throw, they're on an event in the game, not the game itself. Say a free throw would be so easy to miss and to have it gambled on that. Those are the kinds of things that are extremely risky. The bad deal thing, Lyle pointed that out. I mean, that'll get you coverage. I don't think anything would match the sports betting for the amount of negative publicity. I think 12% of the FBS schools have international students. If they do a deal when they're on an F1 visa, theoretically they could be deported. If they're not really careful about it, there's a whole other risk level there. And Title IX, here we are, the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And if you have tremendous discrepancies between men and women, and you get some Title IX lawsuits, that may not look good either. And ultimately, there are other risks that are going to come down the pike. I mean, there are financial risks. If kids are making a lot of money through NIL, will the faculty be willing to have institutional support? Right now in the FBS, there's $1 billion of institutional support. Will that dry up? Will students who provide $600 million of funding to FBS schools, will they want to put up money if kids are making all this money from NIL? So you get risk on your revenue side as well. And finally, the risk of displacement. What happens if I'm an alum and I say, God, I get much better bang for my buck trying to recruit Lyle to come to my university than giving to the university. I'll give my money to the collective. Let's get Lyle to come to my university. Much more direct. You could end up having millions of dollars of heretofore sponsorship money deflected to the student athlete away from the school. So those are all real risks I think you have to deal with.
Yeah, I would agree that there are those types of risks, but there's a Latin term, Latin phrase, it's in loco parentis, and it means in the place of the parent. In the old days, schools were expected to be in loco parentis, meaning standing in the place of the parent. These are adult 18-year-old kids. They can go to war. They can do all sorts of things as an adult. Parents can't even get their educational records anymore. So it's one of those things where in Vietnam, we kind of lost universities in most cases, kind of lost this whole in loco parentis kind of position. And I would say that universities can do a lot to educate, but they're not going to be approving contracts. I think that is a big risk. And I don't think it's a place for a university. Now, from a university trustee perspective, I would say that trustees need to get educated on what's going on in intercollegiate athletics. Usually, trustees are told to stay away until there's a conflict or some type of controversy, whether it's a legal one involving local authorities or something involving the NCAA. Cheating scandals are prevalent. There's going to be I'm going to go out on a limb and say there's going to be a gambling scandal at some university pretty soon. We already know the NFL is dealing with gambling related issues. One of them is an allegation by Flores down at Miami, where he's basically saying the owner offered him a bonus to lose games. Now, in the NFL, you do have other reasons to lose games, right? You get draft picks and all that kind of stuff. But, in college athletics, there's going to be something coming down the road and trustees are going to have to deal with it. You obviously don't want to have those types of controversies in your school. So the best thing to do is be aware, be educated, ask questions, make sure to hold your administration accountable for all the stuff that's going on, and make sure they have a plan. Most schools do not have, most schools have strategic plans, but a lot of their strategic plans don't involve intercollegiate athletics. So intercollegiate athletics is just this thing that operates to the side. It makes money, it loses money. Trustees, they cross their fingers and hope that this industry that they built on top of 18-year-olds or 18 to 22-year-olds is not going to come back to bite them. But in fact, there's a lot of stuff that can happen any day that can come back and bite them. And if they want to keep their head in the sands, I think that's the biggest risk that they have, is to not understand what's going on.
And Michael, the point you bring about, in the place of the parent, it's one of the challenges universities are facing, at a very high level as well within the athletic departments, right? From my experience, my coach was an extension of my parents in my eyes. Obviously he could not do certain things for him, but he was my point of contact on campus if I had an issue in my personal life I wanted to discuss. Many coaches and administrators tell the parents of student athletes, hey, I will look out for your son or daughter when they're on campus. Yet in the thing when a student athlete now needs help with a contract or guidance, those administrators cannot now give them that guidance in this new NIL era, which makes it very challenging because you don't know where to look. If I'm faced with a difficult situation, I'm going to go to those who I trust and I value their counsel most. That's my parents, maybe my aunt or uncle or my coach, right? And if the coach can't say, hey, I can't help you, it's not really a good feeling for a student athlete, whereas the coach is always there on the other side. So it's how do you put those systems of communications or support, as you and Tom, eloquently said earlier, in place to make sure that the school has a plan for that? Because you don't want that kid feeling isolated or all by himself, because that's when you now make bad decisions.
It's funny. There's this theme here of trustees need to be informed. They need to know what's going on campus. But then a lot of the interactions that you describe are very discrete interactions. So my question is, so what advice would you give to a trustee who just wants to learn more about what's going on campus? Where do they physically go when it comes to questions about the athletic program? How do you, do they, talk to individual student athletes? How does one even begin immersing in that, in the culture of the athletic program?
Well,
go ahead.
I'll start. I'll just say that it depends on where you're coming from. If you don't really know anything about athletics, then you should start asking your board office, your administrators, to brief you on the key issues of the day. You should be prepared to ask questions and get responses. That's one way. That's, I think, the best way to start. After that, you'll get approached by a lot of people who will want to tell you their story. When I was a regent, I actually got contacted a lot on sports issues, but also on other issues. It could be a parent, it could be a student, it could be a coach, it could be everybody trying to, figure out how to navigate their own position. And just over time, from listening to these people, you learn a lot about how the system works or doesn't work. And the question is, as a fiduciary of the university, you're getting sued by coaches who were fired or forced out somehow. There's all sorts of, other legal issues that you might need to contend with, but as a group, as a board. But I think in terms of understanding what's going on, you just have to be curious. You have to read the trade rags. There's a lot written about sports every day in this country. And you just have to try to understand as best you can what's going on, and then ask questions. Like I would read something and I would send it to my board office for a comment. If the university was mentioned, or if the Big Ten was mentioned, or even if any school in the country was mentioned on a particular subject, I would ask, well, what are we doing about this? And you should receive an answer. So it just takes time to start being inquisitive and learning about how things work.
One of the things that I would suggest when I was on the Maryland board, I obviously sat down with the ADs and talked to them. I agree with Michael. You have to keep up on the trade publications. Things are changing so quickly. One of the things they asked me to do after I left the Board of Regents was to go back. I made a presentation to them on, kind of the status of college sports. And I did that about 2 years ago, and I gave them an update on all the issues. So board leadership needs to reach out to experts from time to time and bring them in as speakers just to educate your board. Because, most of the time things don't go wrong, but when they do go wrong, it can be very bad. Look, at the University of Maryland, I wasn't on the Board of Regents, but they had a meltdown on athletic issues over a football player that died. And we lost not only the chair of the Board of Regents, we lost, eventually lost the president from that. So it's it can be a very, very, it can have very toxic consequences if you're not informed.
So, I mean, you mentioned, Tom, kind of like how the state of college sports, that was just a couple of years ago. How different is the state of play today than what it was back, even just as recently as back then? And this is a question really for everybody. How much is it going to change in the next, a couple of years?
Well, it's changing drastically every day as we await the work of the Transformation Committee. Basically, if you look at infractions is a big problem that is yet to be solved. The current infraction model that is contemplated by the new NCAA Constitution is just that infractions are now going to be handled at the division level. And so the divisions are now going to be in charge of creating their own infractions infrastructure. And there was, after the Rice report came out, I think it was several years ago, there was a move to kind of move the complex cases outside of the NCAA and hire a bunch of outsiders and pay them millions of dollars to adjudicate these cases. In fact, the University of Kansas, the winner of the of March Madness, is, I think, still under investigation. And this is for something that's years old. And it's the Sneakergate thing involving the payment of, the inducement of getting athletes to come to their schools. So I would say that, there's a lot of stuff that we could be doing now, but we're waiting until the Infractions Committee is actually going to come back and tell us how this is going to work. Greg Sankey said last week on the Paul Feinbaum show that the rule book needs to be skinnied down. Well, what does that mean? You're going to have less rules or more succinct rules, or who knows what they're going to come up with? But you can expect that there's going to be a new rule writing committee that's going to come out of the Transformation Committee, and who knows how long that's going to take. But the key thing is we need to understand how the rules are going to play out and how they're going to be adjudicated if there's a problem with an infraction.
I think I agree a lot with what Michael said. I'm not sure that infractions will go completely to the divisions. It's a hot potato. Really, no one wants it. So they're glad to have someone at the NCAA take it on, maybe with a more streamlined rule book. But the fact of the matter is, where we're heading is to a very devolved structure. This happened in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s, when the NCAA basically let schools decide what kind of deal you're going to give student athletes. And schools started to go, pretty aggressive on that. And eventually the NCAA in the 40s had to pass a sanity rule, which limited what schools could give to a grant and aid and related fees. So what happened was you had a very decentralized environment. And then, of course, they had to re-centralize it. And that really existed for the next 50 or so years. What you're going to have is a very decentralized environment. And it's pretty hard to run a national association with a decentralized environment. So there's going to be problems. And some of the problems that are going to occur is that you're going to have greater and greater stratification. Some schools aren't just going to be able to keep up. Schools are going to lose a lot more than they're losing today. And you're going to have the rich get a lot richer, and the less resource schools have less resources. And so we're coming to an inflection point. And I do think eventually it will land in Congress to try to rationalize this whole thing. I'm not sure how you can have a national association when you have a bunch of different fiefdoms kind of running it, and competitive fiefdoms at that, and also fiefdoms that cannot conspire with each other for antitrust reasons. So it's a mess. I think it's going to get a lot worse. And I do believe at the end of the day, we could have some national initiatives to try to correct things, but we're talking about years away. Let me just give you one reference point. In the 70s, I was on the 72 Olympics. It was a mess. After they came back from that Olympics, they formed a presidential commission to clean up the Olympic movement in the country. It took 5 years from the time that law was passed till you actually got something done in Congress. So we're not looking for anything, I think, overnight. I think that this could take years to resolve. And in the meantime, a lot of this risk is going to be in the laps of our colleges and universities.
I agree with both parties. Like it's what we've now stumbled upon has not just happened by accident. It's been years in the making. And as Tom mentioned, like we have a centralized model now, which is a result of decentralization. But at the same time, centralized models work now with both proper dialogue with your constituents back and forth. However, when that no longer happens, the model somewhat breaks and you move to now a decentralized nature, which was proposed at the last NCAA convention, and basically trying to move things by sport or by division, which will work in a short period of time, I think. Right? The upsides will be great because you'll be efficient, you'll be able to scale, you can now tackle your biggest issues very quickly. But how that now impacts the larger macro picture will now struggle. And as you try to piece them together now, you're back at the same type of problem in a different way, right? So I think it's going to take years or something from the outside. I mean, I think it's interesting, the infractions has always been a hot button topic. Right, for whether you were an administrator or an athletic director, like you say, put it this way: if you were a Fortune 500 company or a publicly traded company, and you're now hit with sanctions or infractions, there are consequences to those actions, right? And everyone knows those fines that are paid in a timely manner. People now have to now step down from boards. There are penalties, right? Whereas on the collegiate ranks, the enforcement and the penalties really have no teeth these days. They can say we're going to now come down with something, but until they actually do, and it's actually met with merit and respect, no one really has that same kind of, fear to do the right thing. I don't know if fear is the right word, the desire to do the right thing, if that makes sense. I believe it was Bruce Pearl, Bruce Pearl, the K-State basketball coach, kind of aired his frustrations, a few weeks back before, he decided to leave K-State or they reached a mutual separation agreement. He's saying, hey, I decided not to cut my hair until they now rule on this case. And he gets some very long hair, right? So it had been years since he kind of shared. What the point being there is, until there's more of a stick for enforcing some of these rules and changes, we'll always be in this fluid situation where some will keep pressing and pressing the envelope, where others will operate at a higher moral, standing.
Right. So, with that in mind, with the NCAA, what is the future of the NCAA? Or if they're no longer the primary, guidance for what schools should and shouldn't do with respect to overseeing athletic programs, what replaces that? Is it the conferences? Is it state laws? Will it be Congress? Who who's best positioned to serve that kind of role?
I'll make a prediction on that. It's like the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. I mean, they're there to make sure there's fair and efficient markets, honest markets. Well, think about the SEC, the NCAA. They're supposed to ensure honest competition. We're supposed to have fair competition across the country. Relying on the conferences to do this, who are uber competitive with each other. I mean, the conferences are in the competition business. They're competing each other. It would be like blowing up the SEC in Washington and sending it down to profit-making enterprises across the country. It would be, you wouldn't have fair and honest markets anymore. And that's sort of what's happening. The NCAA is not a competitor. They don't play games. They don't go out and compete against anybody. The conferences do. And now they're going to be the new Lords of the Ring here. And that system has just innate flaws to it. So what's going to happen? I think you're going to end up at some point having some kind of national organization, but it's going to have to be circumscribed by Congress in some way, in ways that we don't completely understand. But I just can't imagine that you can have national sports without a national fair and honest broker. That's my only point. And I don't know who's going to do that now.
I would just say that, Congress is what everybody's looking to right now. But I don't see Congress being that group. And the NCAA obviously wants to be that group. They're trying to move it down to the division level. Division I, has the all 5 powerful conferences, and they do compete. There's no question. They compete for money. They compete for television deals. They compete for players. They compete for coaches, everything. But I do think that there is the possibility that Division I somehow will get infractions together, or at least the processing of infractions together. The problem right now is that there's just so much out there. For example, back to NIL. You can basically do anything except for you can't participate in inducements. This is as a university. Inducements. Well, what's the inducement? Because now everyone's saying, well, it's direct inducement. Well, what's the difference between direct inducement, and indirect inducement? And then pay for play is the.
Well, what will be an example of an inducement? What will that look like? Kind of like what will be an edge case that you're talking about?
Well, an inducement is basically saying, hey, look, if you come to school here, we'll make sure you get this NIL deal. Okay. So the question is, there are some questions as to whether the early NIL deals that specifically, the gym deal down in Florida was basically, we're going to make sure we give every player on the football team $500 a month. Okay, so the question is that inducement? Because are you actually communicating to the individual recruits and saying that, hey, look, if you come here, we're going to give you this deal? And I'm not even sure if the gym owner actually made it a multi-year deal. I think he directed it to the players who are already there, so maybe inducement wasn't an issue. But pay for play. I mean, a scholarship is pay for play in my mind. And I think in a lot of people's mind, it is already an inducement and pay for play. And a scholarship at school A versus school B, they're going to be different. Everyone's going to have to weigh the differences and say, oh, hey, look, I can do this with this scholarship, and I can do that with that scholarship. And, so there's a lot of ways that we haven't even thought of that these rules, these broad kind of based simple rules, are going to be tested at some point, and some institution is going to spend $50 million, or maybe not that much, but $20 million fighting for whatever their case might be in order to stay out of trouble. So there's a lot of dollars that are going to be spent on legal fees in the future. The
only thing I would say with Michael is I'm not sure that Division I is that much different from the NCAA. It's 93% of the NCAA. And when you're talking about antitrust law and market power, I think Division I has as much market power as the NCAA. So that's why I keep going back to where this is going to go to the conferences, because the conferences, even the judges, the Supreme Court justices, they pointed out that that's where a lot of this action could go, because they don't, at least presently, don't have market power. That may be viewed differently down the road. But to think that Division I is going to have all these new powers, I find that kind of difficult to understand, because that's basically the same as the NCAA. Because if you look at D2 and D3, they have like 7% of the revenues of the NCAA. And if you look at Division I, that includes all the college football playoff revenue and 93% of the NCAA. They've got big market power issues. So I think that a lot of the issues that are coming down the pike are going to, I agree with Mike on this, are going to revolve around money. You know, one of the things that's happening that trustees need to pay more attention to, I'll just tell you a quick story. When I was on the regents at Maryland, I asked my fellow regents a quiz. I said, we just hired a football and basketball coach. How much do you think we have to pay them if we fire them tomorrow? And I raised my hand, 5 million, a couple of hands went up. I put my hand up. How about 10 million? A couple more hands up. And the number was, I think, 29 million. And I think only one region picked it out. And in the last 10 years, the FBS schools have provided $600 million to coaches that are fired. And how many regions are really aware of what is going on financially with these schools? I mean, they're being almost forced to do this by the agents and so forth. And so Maryland just did it again with a new basketball coach. If they want to pay off a $29 million coach, they're going to have to pay 90% of it. This is happening all over the country. And these financial issues are things that regents and trustees need to get on top of.
Yeah, and I would agree with Tom, and I would go back and say that when I was talking about Division I, I'm talking about what the NCAA's current direction is. I'm not saying it's going to be the end solution. I agree with all of the issues that Tom brought up there. And you know, this past year, and just to extend on what Tom's comments were, this past year, we now have the $100 million deals for football coaches. These are guaranteed deals. If they're fired without cause, then they're going to receive a guaranteed payment of $100 million. And I haven't looked closely at those deals, but I would expect that they would be evergreen deals where, you know, either they would add on a year at the end of the next year and always keep it at 100 million or more. Maybe they have escalators in there. But I think one thing that I agree with Tom on is Board of Trustees, they have to have a 101 class on coaches' contracts and where the money goes in athletics.
And the excesses here is what's getting college sports in trouble. These hundreds of millions of dollars of payments to coaches who are no longer coaching, I think that's really, and think about how many kids could be educated with that, kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. And what we're doing is you fire a coach because they're not successful and you pay them. And that's so anachronous to what universities and higher education institutions should be about.
Yeah. It's justified probably because, well, it's money that's coming from the boosters, the foundation. It's not money that otherwise would have gone to the institution. So what's the counter argument there? Like as a board member, how do you argue against that?
I agree. Coaches' salaries and compensation needs a correction. But I think it dates back to now why this is, sports has taken on this, power on campuses. It dates back to the Flutie effect, right? Like, everyone's familiar with what happened to Doug Flutie in it was 86, I believe, when, he tossed that game-winning touchdown pass. And after that, Boston College applications now spiked as a result of that one touchdown pass. And you can say that was another catalyst for them growing their enrollment which now led to more application fees, more tuition dollars generated. The school then rose as well. You can say the same thing has now recently happened at Alabama. If you look at the University of Alabama before Nick Saban arrived as an institution of where they were on undergraduate enrollment population and where they're at now, it's two different universities. So you can see that academics, athletic success can now benefit the overall institution at a high level. But, as Michael said, you have to understand the implications of this. And like what Tom also just stated around the hundreds of millions of dollars of payouts is the essence of why we're at this NIL debate is that, right? Because for so long, they were paying out these massive contracts, yet the student athletes could never make enough money to have a meal on the side, right? It's very rarely where you would have athletes who could now generate a six-figure contract. And looking at the professional ranks, you have a handful of NBA players you see on TV, maybe 5, maybe 6, and these are the best basketball players on the planet. But thinking every college athlete was going to make $100,000, I think was a false pretense. It was only going to be a handful. It was for some now from, low income or other areas to make a little bit of money, because you forget $50 in your pocket extra per week when you're in college is a lot of money when you're in college. My allowance was $100 a month in college, and I was grateful to get $100 a month. If I could now do private lessons on the side of my classes in the spring semester and make an extra $100 twice a week for 3-4 months, that can last me through the entire year. Maybe you don't graduate with student loan debt. So I think understanding the pros and cons of what NIL and what your institution wants to achieve from this, and it comes from your mantra as a university, educating your student athletes or educating your students in general, because 99% of athletes go pro in something other than sports. And that has not changed since Tom was a collegiate athlete. Has not changed since I was a collegiate athlete, and will not change 10 years from now, right? But how do you now make sure that everyone, your students at said school, are empowered to be successful, whether it's in NIL, in academics, on their athletic careers? And I think that's, if you now achieve that North Star as a trustee or a board of trustees, I think you're down the right path.
Yeah, I'll just add to that and say that a lot of people are hopeful that NIL is actually going to keep students in school longer, and it's going to help them actually afford things while they're in school. So I think maybe there is this hope that the graduation rates are going to actually increase for some of these athletes who are students, and that would be a positive effect of NIL, although it remains to be seen.
So I just have one more question before we turn over to audience Q&A. But what's the best case scenario for the next few years? Like, what do you see as the kind of the right way for NIL, so to speak?
I would say that it evolves as a marketplace. It becomes ideally that the NCAA would put some rules in that would stop recruiting inducements, and that, to Lyle's point, these kids get a real good education on building a brand. They learn how to make money. They learn how to manage money. They learn all the things about that. There's a lot of positives here. This could be really, really a win-win. Once people realize that you can't pay someone $8 million because the economics aren't there unless you're just trying to get them to go to that school. And that's where I think they got to have some sanity on this, because and on the recruiting side particularly, that's the one that bothers me the most, because college sports is the only entity in the world where you don't have a draft. I mean, you allocate talent based on where the kid wants to go to school, and that's why the pros have drafts. They allocate talent. But if you're going to allocate talent to the highest bidder, that fundamentally changes college sports.
I'll just echo Tom's thoughts there. I think along the lines of the draft, I think the draft is a thing that was created out of collective bargaining at the pro levels. There probably will never be a draft at the college level.
No.
I think that's probably clear. But I think there are a lot of things we can learn from the pro leagues. I mean, one of the interesting things about the pro leagues is if you look at the salary structures and where the revenue goes, around 50% of the revenue in a pro league goes to the players. And so I think that's going to be something that a lot of people are going to be thinking about in the next couple of years. It's not really NIL oriented. NIL was actually a compromise. Most people don't know this, but it was a compromise from paying employees because the money for NILs is coming from third parties, and it does not affect the university's budget directly. Now, a university can, depending on what the rules are, can invest in trying to become its own agency, where a student going to, I think Ohio State is actually doing this. I read about this before. I haven't read about it since, but I think Ohio State has decided to take a lot of these things in-house and provide services for students as part of trying to get students to come to Ohio State. So I don't know about that exactly. I thought I'd just throw it out there because I think that is one possibility, depending on what the rules are ultimately, that the schools could actually become more and more active, which would be more direct than using a collective or a booster organization. Now, I think the collectives out there, that how a collective is structured, a collective is just a catch-all term that is going to be used for a long time until we start figuring out, what the different collectives are and how they operate, and who's running them and whether or not they're related to the school, and et cetera. So get ready for a lot of adjectives to define collectives as we move forward.
Lyle, best case scenario.
Understanding and acceptance. I think it's just the best case scenario is we will get to a point where the powers that be and the powers that have influence decide now that they want some uniform case of rules, or they want some uniform parameters and guardrails that everyone can operate with it. I think that's the best case scenario. When that exists or happens, I do not know, unfortunately. But I think it's just very difficult right now if you're an administrator to now, or you're a student athlete. Like, what school do you go to? But some states have different rules than other states. How do you now properly evaluate, your prospective college or university, right? It's just difficult. Whereas, it's very clear the difference between a D1 institution and a D2 institution in terms of practice hours, in terms of games, what you can do in season and out of season. That doesn't really exist for NIL right now, right? So it's kind of challenging now to say what now will exist. But I think having some similar guardrails that can be applied from the East Coast to the West Coast, North, South, would be the best case scenario, in my opinion, because then everyone can operate under the same pretenses. But right now, what's going on the West Coast might be different than in the South. And the South is different from the Northeast.
So thank you to all. So I'm going to turn this over right now to my colleague, Aggie Grossman. So I think we have at least one question from the audience. If you, please.
We have actually several questions to get through, which we have to thank our panelists and this great discussion for. So I will just get right into them to try and get through as many as we can. The first question being, is there a conference or university that would be a good example of how to structure and monitor NIL at the campus level? And all of these questions are anyone who wants to take a first go at them is welcome.
Did you say, is there a conference? I'm not sure the question. Can you say that again?
Sure. I think the question is asking, is there a university or kind of a larger, kind of more macro level example on structuring and monitoring NIL that specific institutions or specific campuses of systems can either implement or look towards to create their own policies?
Who's doing this right so far, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you probably have more.
It's a good question, but I would say there are various different examples that are working for the conference and institution that I think are successful. So I really can't give a cut and dry, yes, this is a great example, or no, it's not a great example, because some conferences have, decided to share NIL education as a conference, right? They've signed an education partner for the entire conference, and that partner will now work with all the institutions of said conference, which has worked for that conference. Other conferences have their members have opted to go about this individually, right? There's a lot of great companies out there in the space that are offering different services and expertise, whether it's in, NIL brand building, financial education, public speaking, that schools can now leverage to now prepare your student athletes. But that also they'll complement what the school already has on staff or on campus. I think it was Tom who mentioned the point now. If you have a really good public speaking school, I don't think you're going to bring a public speaker in to teach your athletes how to convey their message, where you now might bring someone in now to teach them about financial literacy. Conversely, if you have a really good accounting program and a financial department on campus, maybe you now bring in that brand builder to help now teach your athletes how to brand build. So I think it's not a one size all fits approach, but I think there's really great examples. If that person wants to reach out to me, you can gladly share them in my email, and I'll gladly give them some really good examples to look at. But it's across the board. I think different levels of success. It's just you should optimize what your campus's strengths are, and then complement the areas that you could now need additional guidance.
Great, thank you. And
yeah, I was just going to answer by saying I don't think there are any best practices yet, at least at the conference level. There might be some schools who think that they have the answer, but I don't think they really know. As we discussed in our discussion, a lot of the actual rules and guidance from the NCAA has been delayed. So we don't really even know what the rules are. I think that a lot of schools are running out ahead, and the ones that are less risk averse are going to go out there and do things, and they're going to have to try and reel them back in. But the genie's out of the bottle, so it's going to be really tough.
Sure. Well, and the other thing that's so interesting is, can you imagine a professional league? The NCAA's, said our Chinese wall is we're not going to get boosters involved. Boosters are not going to be involved. And here we are. Boosters are so involved, but they're not under the control of the athletic department. They're in this ecosystem outside the athletic department. I mean, can you imagine the NFL allowing this to happen? I mean, this is like almost it's laughable in a way that you allow these ecosystems now being built by boosters outside the campus, out of the control of the athletic department. And you're asking ADs, we have nothing to do with it. I mean, I can't even imagine the NFL allowing that to happen. And that's where we are.
Yeah. So our next question is, what are the implications of crypto, NFTs, and Web3 for this college NIL space?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge because there are students out there who will accept crypto as payment. Now, I'm not a crypto person. I did remember seeing a question on my tax return on TurboTax that said, "Do you have any crypto investments?" And so I think the United States government is going to get into it. The IRS is going to get into it. Yesterday on 60 Minutes, they had a story about a surfing town in El Salvador that is becoming a Bitcoin experiment in terms of trying to get Bitcoin to be accepted by local merchants down there. So I think it's happening. I'm not a big fan of currencies that are basically exist only on computers, but I think there are going to be college students who are going to accept crypto for a lot of things, and that includes NIL.
Sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about the NFT angle of this, and Lyle, maybe you could weigh in on this part. There's the idea of creating this item that has kind of this nebulous value, right? I mean, the implications on the tax implications of that for student athletes, right? Like that. I mean, that's that's got to be something that I know that they should be worried about, in terms of making that a part of their NIL portfolio.
That space is changing quicker than NIL is. A lot of my friends work in the venture community or like investors in the NFT metaverse space, and my caution there is buyer caution. If you have the option now of buying something in NFT as a student athlete, I'm thrilled for you, but I think there are more safer investment opportunities to pursue than those right now, because what that landscape could look like in the future could be drastically different than it looks like now. And if there are no rules in NIL, there are absolutely no rules in the NFT cryptocurrency world right now. So I would be very cautious how you approach it. But I think having that conversation is a starting point. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think now having that conversation is wonderful. And saying, hey, student athlete, here's some resources to learn. And I think a lot of those platforms, whether it's Coinbase, Robinhood, some of those more mainstream cryptocurrency NFT platforms have really good educational docs, and I think it's a starting point. But how you should approach rolling that out to your campuses, I would tread with caution there, because I think NIL is first, and we can go down that path.
I will quickly echo. Wow, that's why these Russian oligarchs have artwork, because they can put it on their airplane and they can avoid sanctions. I mean, you think about cryptocurrency. I mean, I do believe that it's here to stay, and it's obviously got staying power. NFTs are a little bit, it reminds me of the 90s. Michael, you probably appreciate that. Remember when the internet world kind of collapsed in the 90s? There's a lot of money being thrown at a lot of NFT companies, and God bless them, and I hope it works. And there's opportunities for student athletes on this. There's no question about it. But to Lyle's point, I think caution is a good word to follow here.
Yes, and I would just add that I did see on the news last week that Tom Brady did spend $400 and some thousand on a ape. What do they call those things? Ape NFT. So it's happening.
Yep.
Interesting times, innovation and whatnot. We have time, I think, for one or two more questions for a turn over to the panel for last words. But
yes. So one interesting question is, we mentioned briefly in the conversation sports betting and situations where a basketball player might throw a foul shot or something like that. What do you think that athletes who sort of showboat to become kind of the fan favorite player, will that affect the integrity of their respective sport?
I don't think that's necessarily the case, but a lot of these kids who maybe miss a free throw in March Madness or something, they may get unbelievable social media pressure. And you read about some of these athletes going to have security guards protect them. I think sports betting is a whole new element to college sports in America. We don't know where it's going to go, but I would say that I don't really worry about that side of it as much as I do sort of the integrity. Where is it all going to go, and what's it mean to our colleges and universities?
Sure.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I did predict earlier. I did go out on a limb earlier, and I said that there will be a gambling scandal involving some sport in college in the near future. But I do think that students, they're in charge of their brand. They're more aware of this than ever before. Hopefully, they have people around them who are helping them with that and understanding all the implications involved. But I think, it's going to be interesting. There's going to be a lot of things that we hear in the next couple of years, and it's stuff that you can't make up.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more audience question. It just came in. And the question is, if regulating the talent acquisition market is the root of the problem, wouldn't collective bargaining be a better solution than federal legislation?
Hypothetically speaking, yes, but that would mean everyone was an employee. And that's what makes it tricky, because unfortunately collective bargaining only exists in all the professional leagues, where those athletes are employees of the team. In the unique case of the MLS, they're employees of the league with Major League Soccer, because they still have a single entity system. Whereas in college, the student athletes are still free to participate as they want. They're not a set employee of said institution. So therefore, collective bargaining or having a CBA would be quite difficult. However, though, I'm not the expert in that one. I will defer to Tom and Michael. It's just my understanding of why that will be somewhat challenging as to how I've read the legislation and interpreted the question.
I will say this, that we've been researching this. The idea of having collective bargaining some level could occur and have student athletes not be employees. For example, maybe, a certain amount of revenue sharing, or a certain amount of it goes incentives for graduation there, or, how much time do I have to practice? All those kind of collaborative decisions could be made. The advantage of a union and collective bargaining is you get statutory relief, statutory exemption on antitrust lawsuits, but theoretically, you could have this more collaborative approach on big issues between management and labor, and not necessarily have to cross the employee line. I'm not sure the employment line, but this is very complicated stuff. And to me, this is kind of maybe where Congress comes in, where they could greatly enhance the benefits to the student athlete while protecting our Olympic movement, but maybe not go so far as unionization or not go so far as the employment relationship. So there could be a win-win for everybody down the road, but it's a tricky path. There's no question about it.
Yeah, I would just say I've spent a lot of time in this space. I'm actually a proponent for athletes as employees, college athletes as employees, just because that's what the current U.S. law says, I believe. Now, people can argue with me on that, but what they can't argue about is the fact that there is such a thing as voluntary collective bargaining, which can happen at any time, regardless of employee status. Now, the conferences, I anticipate one conference may actually decide that they want to do that. That would be that would be against what the current, even the new NCAA Constitution says. So at some point, somebody's going to have to work this out, but I think it is going to happen in the future. I can't explain how it's going to happen, but I think that clearly everybody is realizing now that it's a subject that has to be addressed.
By the way, Michael, how does your dog feel about that?
You can tell he's a supporter.
So great conversation. And so the last word to everybody, real quick, anything that you want to share with the audience? I know that each of you has been or is currently involved in this space in a very active kind of active posture. So if there's anything you want to share as far as your individual organizations that you're representing, or anyone who wants to learn more about NIL or anything in college athletics, how can they reach you? And yeah, so anything you want to share.
Go ahead, Lyle.
Go ahead, Tom. Tom, right, go ahead. All yours.
No.
I hope I own a technology company that provides software to colleges. I'm happy to talk to anyone. I'll drop my email address in the chat. Feel free to reach out with questions. But it's been an honor to share the stage with everyone today. I really enjoyed having this discussion and hearing the different perspectives. And I guess in conclusion, my biggest takeaway is NIL is here and it's here to stay. Right? I don't think it's going anywhere. So as Michael said, it's best to understand what's going on, so you can now help and prepare your institutions for what the future will arise. What that future looks like, unfortunately, I don't know. Hopefully some really smart people can figure it out, hopefully very soon, so we can now have uniformity. But until then, it's just being aware and being knowledgeable, I think, is a start, and asking some questions that might be uncomfortable, but the uncomfortable question is always a good question. And that one now leads to change and the ability to now move forward with certain things.
I'll go. My dog is no longer creating a spectacle. I think that what we're looking at in the future is going to be really exciting for college students, athletes as well as non-athletes, because I think the non-athletes will actually have a chance to be engaged in real life business deals while they're still in college, whereas they're not going to get that from anywhere else. They may get that in an internship with some company, but not all kids are going to have that. Whereas in most colleges, the students are going to have relationships with the students who are marketable in terms of their NIL. So I think that's going to be incredibly exciting at the college level. I do believe that there are going to be some attempts to create guardrails, guidelines, or whatever around the subject, but the free market is really kind of the American way, and I think it's going to be difficult to stop the free market, especially when so many people have jumped out ahead and have created various operating procedures and ways to deal with this in the industry. The big players haven't even really jumped in yet. We have a lot of people, a lot of startups, which is exciting, trying to get into the space either on the compliance side or on the deal side. So it is extremely exciting. It's moving at a very quick clip. And if you wanna catch up, there's still time to catch up, but it's not going to be easy. I think in terms of universities, the biggest question is, where do you want your university to play in this? We haven't talked about it much, but I do think that Division I will subdivide, and you're going to have to figure out where you are on that. If you're going to be with the big dogs, or you're going to be with the little dogs. And so all of these things are going to happen. It's probably going to play out in the next 3 to 5 years. And thank you for having me. I really enjoyed being involved in this discussion.
I'll thank Lyle and Michael for their input, and Armand, thanks for the invitation. Big time college sports is going to change dramatically in the next 5 to 10 years. How it has been inextricably linked to education is going to change. I mean, we're the only nation in the world that has this kind of arrangement where you have big time college athletics coexisting with higher ed. And I think that as college sports evolves, college basketball and football is going to look like mirror images of the NFL and the NBA, with all the attendant good sides and bad sides. And, they'll be taxed like businesses, they'll be treated like businesses. And those are things that policymakers on institutions and trustees and so forth, they're going to have to think about. To Michael's point, how do you want your university to play in that? And what I fear is that there's only going to be a handful of schools who are really going to be able to play the real pro model. There's only going to be a handful, and there's going to be a lot of other schools who will not. And what that means to higher ed across the country is going to be very interesting. And is there a system that can be symmetrical or harmonious for all the schools? Probably not. And what that means for every institution is going to be a different decision. And so we're coming into a brave new world, and NIL is just the cusp of it. We're at the beginning. We're at the tip of the glacier. We got a long way to go, and we hope that we can convene in the future and talk about more of these pressing issues. Thank you.
Very well put. And some exciting and maybe scary times ahead, but a lot to be done in the coming years, and hopefully we can have boards who are engaged on this issue and really forward looking. So thank you to all our panelists today, and thank you for joining us. This has been the latest in ACTA's series of webinars for trustees. For more, please visit our website at www.goacta.org, and look forward to speaking with you all soon. Take care.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks.